the silence we learn to live with. Some families are loud. They argue, they shout, they break things, then fix them again. Ours wasn't like that. In our house, silence did all the work. From the outside, we looked calm, respectful, well-mannered. People used to say, "You're lucky. Your parents raised you well." I believed that for a long time. But what no one saw was how silence slowly teaches you what you're allowed to ask and what you're not. Growing up, there was one rule we never talked about. It was never written, never explained. You just felt it. Some topics made the room colder. Some questions ended conversations too quickly. Some names were spoken carefully, or not at all. As a child, I didn't think much of it. Adults have secrets. Families have boundaries. That's what I told myself. But silence has a strange way of growing louder with time. I remember moments that didn't make sense back then. The way my parents exchanged looks before answering certain questions. The way conversations changed direction without warning. The way one person in our family was always protected. Not praised. Not celebrated. Protected. At the time, I thought it was love. Years passed. Life moved forward. I grew up believing that quiet obedience was maturity. I became the one who didn't push, didn't question, didn't disturb the peace. Because peace mattered more than answers. Or so I was taught. But as an adult, I started noticing cracks in that peace. Little things. A story that didn't match another. A memory my parents didn't share the same way. A moment when someone defended behavior that didn't deserve defense. Still, no one spoke directly. And I didn't ask. Because silence had trained me well. The truth is, silence doesn't just hide secrets. It creates roles. Someone becomes the one who keeps quiet. Someone becomes the one who is shielded. Someone becomes the one everyone adjusts for. And no one notices. Until the weight becomes too heavy for one person to carry. The moment everything began to change wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a small realization that landed quietly in my chest. I was protecting the family image. But who was protecting the truth? That question followed me everywhere. In the kitchen. At family gatherings. In the pauses between conversations. I started listening differently. Watching more closely. Not to accuse. Not to judge. Just to understand. Because when a family stays silent for too long, it's usually not because the truth is dangerous. It's because the truth would make things uncomfortable. And comfort had always mattered more than honesty in our home. I didn't know it yet. But I was standing at the edge of something important. A truth that had been buried under years of good intentions. A silence that had protected someone. And quietly limited everyone else. This wasn't going to be a story about revenge. There would be no shouting. No dramatic exits. Just a slow, careful choice. To stop carrying silence that was never mine to begin with. And once that choice is made, nothing stays the same again. What silence was hiding? Once I started paying attention, the silence changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was crowded. Crowded with pauses that came too fast. With answers that were too careful. With stories that felt rehearsed. I noticed how my parents chose their words. Not randomly, deliberately. Certain memories were shared openly. Others were shortened. Edited. And then there was one person in our family who never faced consequences the way the rest of us did. Mistakes were explained away. Behavior was softened. Responsibility was quietly redirected. I told myself I was imagining things. That every family has one sensitive situation. One person who needs extra understanding. But patterns don't lie. The more I watched, the clearer it became. Silence wasn't protecting the family. It was protecting one version of the family. And everyone else had learned to adjust. I remembered moments from years ago. Times when I almost asked something. Then stopped. Not because I was told not to. But because I felt I shouldn't. That feeling didn't come from nowhere. It was taught. Slowly. Patiently. Lovingly. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. Nothing dramatic. Just a sentence spoken too freely. It's better this way. If people knew, it would change everything. They didn't see me standing there. They didn't know I heard it. But that sentence settled inside me like a stone. Better for whom? That was the moment I stopped assuming good intentions were harmless. Good intentions can still cause damage. When they erase accountability. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Truth doesn't need to be rushed. It needs to be understood. I began asking questions, gently. Not accusations. Just curiosity. Sometimes I got answers. Sometimes I got silence dressed as reassurance. It's complicated. You wouldn't understand. We handled it the best way we could. Those answers told me more than any confession could. Because when people protect a secret for too long, they stop remembering why. They just know they must. I realized something painful but important. My parents weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to keep life manageable. They believed that if one truth stayed hidden, everything else could stay intact. But silence has a cost. And that cost was shared. Unevenly. I had grown up learning to be careful, responsible, restrained. Not because I needed to be. But because someone else needed space to remain unchanged. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired of carrying a balance that was never fair. Tired of protecting peace that depended on pretending. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want exposure. I wanted alignment. I wanted honesty, even if it was quiet. And that's when I made a decision. Not to reveal the truth. Not to force answers. But to stop playing my part in the silence. Because silence only works when everyone agrees to keep it alive. And I was done agreeing. The truth didn't come out in one moment. There was no confession. No dramatic reveal. No apology waiting to be spoken. It came together slowly. Piece by piece. Like a picture you don't recognize until you step back. I noticed how stories changed depending on who was listening. How timelines shifted slightly each time they were told. How responsibility was always blurred, never placed. And then there were the excuses. Too consistent. Too practiced. That's when I understood something important. When people are protecting someone, they don't just hide facts. They manage perceptions. They control how much you see. How much you remember. How much you question. I began remembering things I had dismissed before. Moments when consequences should have followed, but didn't. Moments when accountability was redirected toward circumstances, stress, or misunderstanding. Moments when silence stepped in exactly when clarity was needed most. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger needs doubt. And doubt was gone. I saw the full shape of the truth now. My parents had chosen silence because they believed it was kinder. Kinder than conflict. Kinder than honesty. They thought protecting one person would protect everyone. What they didn't realize was that protection had a shadow. And that shadow fell on the rest of us. I saw how my own behavior had been shaped by it. How careful I became. How measured my words were. How often I stepped back so others could stay comfortable. Not because I was weaker, but because I was trained to preserve balance. Once I saw that clearly, something inside me relaxed. I stopped trying to prove anything. Stopped hoping someone would admit the truth out loud. Because I didn't need confirmation anymore. The truth had already shown itself. Through patterns, choices, and silence. And here's the part that surprised me most. Knowing the truth didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel free. Free from confusion. Free from self-doubt. Free from the need to keep explaining myself. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need justice delivered loudly. I needed alignment between what I felt and how I lived. So I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop protecting silence that wasn't protecting me. I would stop adjusting my life to preserve an imbalance. I would live honestly, even if others chose not to. That decision didn't break the family. But it did change the rules. Because once one person steps out of silence, the silence loses its power. And from that moment on, everything began to shift, gently, but permanently. I didn't announce my decision. There was no meeting. No confrontation. No dramatic line delivered at the dinner table. I simply stopped doing what I had always done. I stopped covering. Stopped adjusting. Stopped carrying responsibility that was never mine. At first, it looked like nothing had changed. The family routine stayed the same. Conversations sounded familiar. Smiles appeared when expected. But underneath, something had shifted. Because silence depends on cooperation. And I had quietly withdrawn mine. When situations came up that once required me to soften things, I didn't. When excuses were offered, I didn't repeat them. I didn't correct anyone either. I just let moments sit exactly as they were. Uncomfortable. Unedited. At first, people didn't notice. Then they did. Questions started appearing, small ones. Looks lingered longer than before. Pauses stretched. No one blamed me. They couldn't. I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't exposing anything. I was simply no longer helping the story stay smooth. And that was enough. I noticed how the person who had always been protected began to feel the difference. Not through punishment. Through absence. The absence of cover. The absence of quick explanations. The absence of someone stepping in to balance things out. For the first time, their choices stood on their own. And for the first time, others saw them clearly. This wasn't revenge. Revenge wants a reaction. This wanted alignment. I stayed calm. Consistent. Grounded. And something unexpected happened. The family didn't collapse. No one screamed. No one walked away. Instead, the atmosphere changed. Conversations became careful in a different way. Not controlled, thoughtful. People began noticing patterns they had ignored before. Not because I pointed them out, but because they were finally visible. That's the strange thing about truth. You don't have to push it forward. You just have to stop holding it back. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly. When someone chooses not to play a role anymore. And that choice, simple as it was, began doing what years of silence never could. It created space. Space for accountability. Space for honesty. Space for each person to carry their own weight. And in that space, the family had a choice to make. Once the balance shifted, everything responded to it. Not loudly. Not immediately. But steadily. The family dynamic began to change in small, undeniable ways. Mom became quieter, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. She listened more than she spoke. Dad stopped finishing other people's sentences. He let conversations end where they naturally fell. And the person who had always been protected started feeling the weight of being seen. Not judged. Seen. There were moments of discomfort. Moments when no one rushed to explain things away. Moments when responsibility stayed exactly where it landed. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Almost wrong. We had lived so long smoothing things over. That honesty felt sharp. But sharp doesn't mean harmful. It just means real. I noticed how my parents struggled with the change. Not because they didn't care, but because they were facing something they had avoided for years. The cost of their silence. They began realizing that protecting one person had required quiet sacrifices from everyone else. Time. Emotional energy. Fairness. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. The shift was visible in how decisions were made now. Rules applied evenly. Expectations were clearer. Boundaries were respected. And the person who had once relied on protection had to adapt. There was resistance at first. Confusion. Frustration. Not because they were being treated unfairly, but because they were being treated equally. That's often the hardest adjustment. I stayed consistent. No lectures. No reminders. Just presence. I didn't step in to rescue. Didn't smooth over moments of discomfort. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The tension eased. Because when roles dissolve, people find their real shape. My parents began speaking differently to me. With less instruction. More honesty. Not as someone who needed to keep the peace, but as someone whose perspective mattered. That change alone felt like closure. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like consequences. Sometimes it looks like balance being restored. The silence hadn't protected peace. It had delayed growth. And growth, once it starts, doesn't need force. It just needs space. By the time we all noticed how far things had shifted, the old way felt distant. Not forgotten. But no longer in control. And that's when I knew. The softest choices often create the deepest change. Nothing returned to the way it was. And that was a good thing. The family didn't break apart. We didn't become strangers. We didn't lose love. We lost pretense. And in its place, something more honest grew. Conversations became simpler. Not easier, but clearer. There were still awkward moments. Still pauses where silence tried to return. But now, silence was a choice. Not a habit. My parents never apologized directly. And I didn't need them to. Understanding arrived in other ways. In how they listened. In how they stopped protecting what shouldn't be protected. In how they allowed responsibility to exist without rushing to erase it. The person who had once been shielded changed too. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But they began carrying their own weight. And that was enough. I learned something important through all of this. Justice doesn't always mean exposure. It doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes justice is simply no longer participating in what hurts you. Sometimes revenge isn't about doing something to someone else. It's about stopping something within yourself. Stopping silence. Stopping adjustment. Stopping the need to keep things comfortable at your own expense. I didn't win anything dramatic. No applause. No recognition. But I gained peace. And peace is powerful. Families don't heal through secrets. They heal through honesty. Even when that honesty arrives quietly. The truth didn't destroy us. It freed us. And if there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Silence can protect in the short term. But truth protects everyone in the long run. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop being quiet.